All right, Kevin, back with you for another episode of the $1 Million Relationships podcast. And this is going to be an awesome episode. Here we are. Well, first of all, Perry, welcome. And I got to tell you, I'm so excited to be having this conversation today with you.
So, I am too. And no better person than Kevin to talk about relationships.
And it's interesting because you and I were talking before, and before we hit the record button here. And yes, a podcast that is focused on relationships and inspiring listeners to place an intentional focus on creating more real, meaningful, valuable relationships. I mean, I have two really long-standing business relationships like my entrepreneurial career started in 1996 when I started. I'd been first fishing in Alaska as a commercial fisherman for 7 years, saved up money, started a cleaning and restoration business in 96, blew through $300,000 and still didn't know what the heck I was doing. So this whole notion of if I just had more money, I'd be successful. No, BS. Not true. And so, blew through 300,000 that I had saved up and still didn't know what I was doing. Found Joe Polish in a trade magazine for the industry, invested in him and his help. And I met Joe Polish in 1997. And then through Joe Polish, I met Dan Kennedy and I started subscribing to Dan's newsletter, ended up going to a Dan Kennedy seminar 2 years later in 1999. And that's where I met you. And you and I so Joe Polish, 25 years, Perry and Kevin, 23 years. And so to talk about the impact of relationships, I mean, who better than you and I to be talking about that?
Yeah, man.
And beyond revenue, beyond business, which both of us have helped each other immensely. Well, you know what? I'm not going to say how much I help you. What I will say, Perry, is I know you've helped me immensely.
You're customer number one for my Google AdWords book. So that seems like a pretty significant. We've sold 100,000 copies of that. So
well, there you go.
The first one, and I also remember some meeting where several people, I was in a mastermind group and several people were saying, yeah, I wish my people would do more because I only got this one guy who's doing everything I tell him to do and he's doing great. And they both figured out that they were both talking about you.
Nice.
Yeah, well, Kevin's an executing, implementing kind of guy. So, and also a lesson about how not everybody in the world is a Kevin.
Yeah. Sometimes I've had a number of times people tell me we had a conversation and then I went and did it. And they're like, you know what? I didn't realize you were going to do it that fast. You kind of threw me off guard. So there I suppose can be pros and cons to that. And but it as a general rule, it's definitely served me well over the years. And and even beyond business. I mean, I remember because it's been 8 years since we adopted Abby. It's been about 10 years that we were in Jamaica as a family. We have this orphanage down there that we support, and we do this through our family foundation and stuff. And we were visiting this orphanage, and on the way back to the hotel afterwards, on the bus back home, my wife was like, honey, I want to adopt. And I'm going to Perry, I'm like, that totally threw me for a loop. And I'm like, honey, we got 6 kids already. We're good. And she goes, I know, but she goes, I think we can impact the life of one child and give them a leg up that they would not get to have if it weren't for somebody like us. And she goes, honey, I just feel really compelled to do this. And I'm not going to lie, Perry, that rocked my world. I'm even right now thinking about this. I'm sweating a little bit. I'm starting to, because how it made me feel. And you were the first guy I reached out to because I knew you had adopted. And I remember sending you a message going, Perry, Lisa's talking about adoption, and I'm just like, I don't know what to think about this. I was like, can we please talk? And you shared such valuable insight with me, and really opened my mind to a perspective I hadn't looked at, and really kind of like through this process, I come to realize that, you know what, this is a good thing, and we are going to do something here, and this is, I do want this. And like now, 10 years later, 8 years after having adopted Abby, she is now 12 years old. She is just such, it's like she's always been part of our family. And it has been such a rewarding experience. And I remember one time getting your Christmas letter where you were talking about how you had adopted again. And when I handed it to Lisa, I was like, honey, when you read this, don't get any ideas. We're not adopting again. Okay. So, I don't normally share this much on these podcast interviews about the person I'm interviewing, but you and I have a long history. I mean, 23 years is something that I am really proud of. I consider myself really blessed having you as a friend, and having you that I can just pick up the phone or shoot a text message and the door is open. And Perry, I just want to publicly acknowledge that. I have appreciated our friendship, our relationship for 23 years. And I feel like, I just turned 57 last month, and I feel like I'm just now really starting to get into the flow of things. So, lots of water under the bridge. And so I'm really excited to have you here today. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of start off turning it over to you, and let you share a little bit. What are you doing? What are you working on? Who do you serve? What inspires you to do what you do? Who is Perry Marshall? We'll just kind of start there and set a little bit of context for everybody.
I wish there was a really simple pigeonhole answer that I could give you, but it's a little more complicated than that. The answer used to be, I'm the Google AdWords guy. Mm-hmm. And even though that was never just it was never just that. It was certainly good enough for most purposes.
Yep.
And it brought a lot. So you could say, I'm the first guy in the direct marketing space to really grab onto Google's advertising system and teach it to hundreds of thousands of people. And we have books on Google, Facebook, TikTok, and very soon YouTube that are, by the way, now written by co-authors, because those are the real experts. And then I have a lot of work around 80/20. And I help a lot of people get their businesses from 7 figures to 8. That's one of the things that I think that we do best. And then about a third of my life is spent as a scientist. And doing science work. I have a science research foundation that does cancer research. I have a $10 million technology prize for the origin of the genetic code, which really goes to some of the deepest questions in science. And like I said, about a third of my life is spent doing that kind of stuff, and I really enjoy it. And one of the reasons I became an entrepreneur was because I knew that I had things like that I wanted to do. And if I was 45 years old punching a clock at some company because I needed the health insurance with a ball and chain around my ankle, I would have failed, and I wouldn't be able to pursue those kinds of things. And I think that not every entrepreneur is like that, but a lot of people that we know and love and work with, they have things that they want to do. It could be something like adopting kids, right? It could be charitable stuff. It could be skydiving or something. But in any case, so that's kind of a picture of me. And I have 6 kids, 4 standard issue and 2 adopted, and a wife. And I live in Chicago. and life is very adventurous and has lots of interesting people. And I'll just add that, when you're like 25 or 30 years old and you show up at some conference somewhere, you don't necessarily realize that some of the people you meet are going to be your colleagues 20 years from now. And they're going to know some of the bones in your closet, and you're going to, and you're going to know things like that. And you meet the same people on your way down as you met on the way up. And, and all of that. Like sometimes it just never really occurs to you that, these relationships might last a really long time, and this person might prove to be very important, even though you just bumped into them on the way to the bar, or you just happen to sit next to them after the afternoon break, right? And so, well, I know that now.
Yeah,
Here we are.
Hindsight's always 2020, isn't it? Yeah. And it's, and it's such a good reminder. You said it's like, and we all go through ebbs and flows, and some of them can be extreme ebbs and flows. And you are absolutely right to be able to have those relationships in place, that when the shit hits the fan, you got people that you can call, and that will, more importantly, that they'll take your call. It's important. It's important. And so, I mean, I was, my whole motivation for even doing this podcast was because I've understood the value of relay. In fact, as an entrepreneur, I believe that relationships are the most valuable asset we possess. Everything else comes from that.
I agree. And if the world economy crashed and burned tomorrow, and all of your business went away, or guys in black suits came and shut down all your bank accounts, the only thing you've got is your relationships with your colleagues and your friends. And that's how you're going to get out of it.
That's right.
It's not because you know how to use Google ads or write copy or make industrial widgets or whatever it is that you do.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I remember you saying one time years ago that, what really is important is how many people know you for not just what you do, but who you are. Yeah, mm-hmm. That's what it is who you are.
Yes.
And, so, well, okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. I'm going to reiterate the question for the benefit of the listeners. Have you ever been introduced to a person that completely changed the course of your life or your business, so much so that much of what you have today would not be possible if not for this person? And I'm just really excited to have you share your story, your experience around this.
So for me, that would be Richard Koch.
Okay.
And Richard he's a billionaire today. He wasn't when I met him. He was worth a mere 200 million back then.
Gotcha. Okay.
And he's an author of a bunch of books, including the 80-20 principle. So I guess I'll just start from the beginning.
Yeah.
It starts when Ken McCarthy, almost 20 years ago, said, hey, there's this guy named Richard Koch. He's got this book called the 80-20 principle. Everybody's got to read this book. And I bought the book and I took it to a coffee shop. And I knew at that time probably about what the average person knows about 80-20, which is not much. Mm-hmm. I knew that in most countries, 20% of the people have 80% of the wealth, and 80% of the people have 20% of the wealth. And I knew that sort of seemed to apply to customers, and that was about the extent of it.
Okay.
And I didn't really know that it was particularly important. I thought it was just a miscellaneous little fact that somebody happened to notice somewhere. And I'm reading Richard's book, And first of all, it's an excellent book, and it shows how 80/20 applies in all kinds of things. And I think everybody ought to read that book, even if they already read my book. That then he made this comment about 80/20 has a lot to do with fractals and chaos, and I had studied those things quite a bit already, and I put two and two together. I'm like, whoa, that means 80/20 moves from out at the outer edge, like something written on a post-it note somewhere, to like, this is one of the most central facts. It's one of the most central operating principles of business and life in general. This is a universal principle. This isn't just a little business rule of thumb. And it completely, all of a sudden, I started seeing that everything that I already knew about business and marketing could be recast into an 80/20 filter, and it would make it simpler and easier to understand, and it would all hang on a very common set of hooks. And then you could explain why almost anything that works in business, why it works, has an 80/20 explanation. And so at that time, I was just starting to write the AdWords book, the Google book. And I realized that everything about a Google account or a Google campaign was an exercise in finding the 80/20 levers. So my 80/20 book was really a, how do you apply 80/20 to writing ads, impressions, clicks, conversions, like everything, campaign organization, you name it, all of the stats, all the deliverables, everything that comes after that. And so I did talk about 80/20 in the book, but really the book was 80/20 applied to a Google account. Here's what you do. And so my whole business at that time, the book came out, and then it went supernova, and Google went supernova, and so now everything was oriented around Google ads. And what started to happen was I would teach people Google, but then I would teach them 80/20, and then they would have a tool belt for understanding almost anything that they learned later. So I went on and did that. Well, so about almost 10 years went by, and I get Rich Sheffrin forwards me this fax that he got from a guy in New Zealand who was teaming up with Richard Koch to do some kind of an 80/20 seminar in the United States. And we got introduced. And so I eventually end up having a conversation with Richard, and we decided to work together a little bit. And then I went to visit Richard in Portugal because I was in Europe. He said, hey, if you're ever in Europe, stop by. So I did. In fact, I was having my dinner with my wife one night, and she said, so where are you going next? I go, I don't know. I just come back from an international trip. And she goes, well, you got to go somewhere. Like, where can you go? And that's kind of how Laura is. She always encourages me to push the envelope and explore things. Some spouses have this little jealousy thing, like, well, you can't go to Cancun if I didn't get to go to Cancun. She is not like that. She cheers me on, and I go, well, come to think of it, Richard Koch invited me over. She goes, wait a minute. You're like going to this mastermind and this seminar and this thing, and you got a guy worth $200 million. He invited you over to his house and you haven't gone yet? I'm like, okay. Hey, Richard, I'm going to come and see you. All right. And so I go to see him. And now, Kevin, you talk about relationships, and a lot of times on a podcast or with coaches and consultants, relationship, the connotation of relationship is very squishy or like lovey-dovey or, you know, Barney or something. My relationship with Richard isn't like that.
Okay.
But then also sometimes people talk about relationships and it sounds lovey-dovey, but it's actually just purely transactional.
Mhm.
Like, well, I got a relationship with my list. Yeah, but most of these people don't actually know you and you don't actually know them. So I'm not talking about either one of those things. I'm talking about something else, which is when somebody becomes a very important mentor, not only one-on-one, but also at a distance, because what they know and what they bring to the world is so valuable.
Mhm.
And so I really kind of have both with Richard. And I experienced something at his house that I think I could have only experienced at his house,
Okay.
which was, wait a minute, this guy really actually only works an hour a day. Now, I've been to lots of seminars, and I was in Amway 30 years ago, and I know that the whole like personal development space and the marketing space, and I know an awful lot of the authors and the gurus and everybody, and there's all kinds of people talking about passive income, residual income, walk away income, all this kind of stuff. And honestly, about 96% of the time, anybody that even talks that way, you should run the other way.
Mhm.
Like, I'm not exaggerating, not all the time, but it probably 19 times out of 20, if they're talking about passive income and walk away income and any of these buzzwords, they are full of crap.
Mhm.
And they are running, they are pedaling furiously on a hamster wheel right behind the stage curtain
Mhm.
while they talk about being free and like all this kind of stuff. And honestly, most subject matter experts and most people like that, they're not particularly wealthy.
Mhm.
They're often above average and they often do really cool things. But most of the time, they don't like really have any serious wealth behind them.
Mhm. Mhm.
Richard was worth 200 million, and now he's worth well over $1 billion.
Mhm.
And Richard truly worked an hour a day because I saw it. I saw his daily routine. He gets out of bed, he spends an hour, hour and a half on his investments, then he eats breakfast, then he goes for a 3-hour bike ride, then he comes home, then he spends the afternoon reading, writing, researching, mostly writing books and pursuing whatever rabbit trails that he's interested in. And he has a lot of books about a lot of subjects, so it's not just business. And I saw this firsthand, and like he's not even particularly bragging about it. It's like, oh, this is an 80-20 guy if I ever saw one.
Mhm.
Now he told me something very interesting the other day. He goes, now that I'm a billionaire, I've been working about a day and a half a week on my investments.
We just had to ramp it up a little.
He's upped his level.
Yeah, yeah.
But I saw this was real. And now to let me put this in a framework, because this is how I understand it. My colleague Tim Francis, who's also a good friend, has a really brilliant little triangle that he calls the 5 levels of 80-20.
Okay.
And this is really useful and it's really worth talking about. And it's not a diversion from Richard at all. He said, Tim says there are 5 levels at which you exercise the 80-20 principle in your life and in your business. The first level is personal. How do you manage your time, and what are your values, and who's important to you, and who are your friends, and like you ought to, like the important people ought to get the most attention, and that's the lowest level of 80-20. And it's also like your work ethic and stuff like that. And then level 2 is skills. I know how to remediate mold. I know how to be a carpet cleaner. I know how to be a Google AdWords expert. I know how to be a copywriter, right? That's the skill level. And then there's management level. I manage people who have skills. And then there's the CEO level, and that's managing people who manage people. It's managing a whole organization. And then the 5th level is investor. And the investor is the person who puts their money in, but they do not put their time in. Now, most people probably who are listening to this, investment, they think Wall Street. They go put their money in real estate or stock market or something like that. And all of their business activities are in levels 1 to 4. But a private equity investor is the person who sits at the gap between level 4 and level 5. And Richard is a private equity investor. He's not putting his money in Wall Street. He's putting in his money in private companies, which anybody who knows anything about venture capital or private equity or that's a complicated game, and it's not easy to play. But Richard operates at level 5. He doesn't run these companies, and he doesn't spend a lot of time advising them, and he certainly doesn't manage them, and he doesn't use his skills in them. He invests. And I saw that. I was like, okay, this is one of the best undiscovered business stories I've ever found, is Richard. And we decided to do a seminar, which we did about a year later, and it was called the Star Principle Seminar in 2014, and it was in Chicago, and it was $7,500 a head. And we had about 80 participants show up, and it was legendary. And that seminar is still producing fortunes. I am still having people who went to that seminar who are now selling their companies for $10 million and stuff like that. It was very significant. Okay, so back to Richard. Richard has a greater level of conviction than almost anybody you've ever met, or maybe anybody that you've ever met, that the world runs according to a handful of simple principles. And there's not 1,000 things you need to know to run a business. There's like 3. Okay. And Richard will tell you exactly what they are. They are 80-20. Like, you need to learn 80-20 inside out, upside down, backwards and forwards, every which way, because it applies to just about everything that ever happens in any business or anywhere in the world. Number 2 is the STAR principle. And the STAR principle says almost all of the returns of all of the investments or all of the success in business come from companies that are number 1 in a growing market. And if you're not number 1 in a growing market, you better either figure out how to be or go do something else. And Kevin, if you go, and this really clicked in place, because I realized that every time that I had a major success in business, it was because I had been number 1 in a growing market. Kevin, you were the number 1 mold guy for, I don't know, 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
Until you weren't interested in that and you went and did other things. But for making black mold stop in your house, like, you made yourself the number 1 guy in the internet. And that's why it was so successful. You weren't number 4 and you were in a growing market. It was especially because the internet was growing and nobody else was the king of that.
Yeah.
And you weren't the king of that offline, you were the king online.
Yeah.
And what the STAR principle says, if you're not number 1, then find a place where nobody is number 1 and make yourself number 1.
Yeah. 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 You know, it's interesting. I remember that I heard this story about Bob Vila claiming the title of #1 home improvement, the nation's #1 home improvement expert. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to claim that title. And there were people in the industry that were not happy about that, like asking me, who the heck do you think you are? I mean, you live up in this podunk little town in Washington State. I'm in LA or I'm in Chicago or I'm wherever, and we do all this. But thanks to the power of the internet, thanks to that, I learned Google AdWords. I built this subscriber list of about 19,000 people. And before you know it, I had spoke with more people on the subject of black mold and what to do about it than anybody else in the industry, thanks to technology.
So the third thing that Richard says that everybody needs to know is the concept of simplifying. And I don't mean it in the generic, like look it up in the dictionary sense. I mean it in a very, very specific sense. And I'll just give you half of it because we don't have a lot of time, but it's the most important half. It's proposition simplification. And a proposition simplifying says, I am going to make a product that, because it is simpler and more elegant than everybody else's product, that it becomes a joy to use, and I will pay a premium price for it. And if you put it in 80-20 language, it's 500% of the utility for 120% of the price. So, for example, an iPad is a proposition simplifier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A 7-year-old can use a Windows machine, but a 2.5-year-old can watch videos on an iPad and play games and sit on the airplane. And like a 2.5-year-old can't use a Windows machine. It's too complicated, right? A Tesla is a proposition simplifier. They made driving an electric car not only possible and easy, but sexy, so that you would pay a premium price for it. Amazon is a proposition simplifier. One click and it's delivered to you, and it's all the stuff in the world. And Uber is a proposition simplifier, and Spotify is a proposition simplifier. And what Richard would tell you is, if you know 80-20, star principle, and simplify, you don't need to know anything else. Okay. It's an extreme reductionism of what really matters in business. And this is how Richard thinks. And this is why most venture capitalists, most private equity investment firms, they have a platoon of MBAs doing all this analysis. Richard doesn't have any of that. He has an HP 12C financial calculator.
Wow.
And his network has grown almost 10x in the last decade.
Yeah. And
his rate of return is right even almost with Warren Buffett. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in 30 years, he turned $4 million into well over $1 billion.
Yeah.
Very smart guy. So let me describe a little more, because I think Richard is one of the most underrated authors. There's lots of business authors, and there's way too many business books coming out. There's a fire hose of business books, and most of them are not worth reading. Most of the latest bestseller list is not worth reading. I think you should read Richard's book, Simplify. You should read Richard's book, Star Principle. You should read his 80-20 book. And those 3 books will tell you most of what you need to know about business in general. And Richard has a skill, and I don't think most people appreciate what his real skill really is. But I'm going to tell you, and I'll give you an example. Richard's real skill is looking at 1,000 situations with 10,000 variables and saying, there's this huge range of situations and stories and businesses, and there's 10,000 factors that had something to do with them, but all 1,000 had these 10 factors in common. And the other 999, no, wait, 9,990, they don't really matter too much. It's Richard's ability to do that is his real superpower.
Wow. Wow.
And I'll give you an example. He wrote a book called Unreasonable Success. And the way it is a study of the lives of about 20 people, including Leonardo da Vinci, Madonna, St. Paul, Vladimir Lenin, Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill. Like, you get this is a very crazy diverse list of people.
Yeah.
In fact, I happen to know that Adolf Hitler came really close to being in the book, but the publisher thought it was just too controversial because from a particular point of view, Hitler was very successful. Mm-hmm. Highly objectionable, but he moved a lot of masses, right? Mm-hmm. And what this book says is all of these people, including a whole bunch of people that didn't make it into the book, have 9 things in common.
Wow.
And he pinpoints what those 9 things are.
Okay.
It's very interesting. That is Richard's superpower. Which, if you want to get a little philosophical, that is the exquisite use of inductive reasoning and it's solving riddles. Because, hey, I got 1,000 situations with 10,000 factors. Which 10 do they all have in common? That's a riddle.
Yeah.
And riddle solving and inductive reasoning is much more difficult than linear logical deductive reasoning. See, deductive reasoning is, see these 9 things, go apply the 9 things. That's deductive reasoning. Mm-hmm. Inductive reasoning is figuring out what they are in the first place.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And that's how you get down to principles. Because the world, there's literally a million things going on. Mm-hmm. There's a million things you could pay attention to. What 3 things should you actually pay attention to?
Yeah.
I mean, Richard might add a 4th network effect, which is when buyers attract sellers and sellers attract buyers and buyers attract sellers. But if you take 80-20, star principle, simplify a network effect, those are the 4 things that make a successful investment. Therefore, that's why I've been teaching those things. And so if you look at my work and you say, what does Perry really do? Well, he's made Richard's work digestible and understandable to marketers and small entrepreneurs, where Richard's work tends to be aimed at somewhat bigger companies and a little more of a corporate crowd. And then I go off and I do these science things and start the world's largest technology prize and stuff like that. So that's my relationship with Richard. And we kind of tune in and out. A couple months might go by and we don't really talk, and then there'll be a big flurry of emails or phone calls or something. We'll talk about stuff for a while, and that's how I am with most of my relationships. Is they go quiet for a while, and then all of a sudden something interesting happens, and so it's been extremely valuable. And I also feel like I've really only got 10% of it. Like I don't think my mastery of this stuff is anywhere near what his is, and he's 20 years older than me, so maybe that's to be expected. But people in my audience, they revere his work. And I tell all of my clients and students, you need to go read these books. And these books are more important than almost anything else on your shelf. And so I've learned to think that way. And it's a very contrarian way of thinking and it's a relief too, because guess what? You don't have to read all the latest books that are coming out. I think a lot of people feel guilty. They're just fire hosed with all this information. Well, guess what? You can turn most of it off and it will not hurt you one bit. In fact, it will help.
Yeah. Yeah. You free up your bandwidth to focus on what's most important. And here is an example of a guy who's done that with incredible success,
Yeah.
And, so
can I mention one
go ahead.
that deserves mention? I mentioned Richard goes on a 3-hour bike ride every day. And what he does is he mentally takes all of the questions and the problems that he's working on, and he goes, okay, brain, go work on that. And he kind of sticks it in the back warehouse, so to speak. And then he gets on his bike and he forgets about everything. And Kevin, you and I have both heard many people, usually very successful, have some version of that. We've heard Dan Kennedy talk about, well, I load it in the subconscious and I say, dude, you got to write some great sales copy about this. So, and my copywriter and collaborator, John Fancher McGee, he does that. When he's got any kind of a writing assignment, he makes sure he schedules some time to do the research and do some reading and assimilate, and then put it on the shelf, forget about it, come back to it next week. And almost always when he comes back to it next week, all of a sudden a whole bunch of angles and ideas and inspiration comes. And as long as you're not putting too much pressure on yourself, which kills creativity.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very reliable way of making things happen. And so, yeah, I think that I'd be remiss if I left that out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's huge right there. So this is, I mean, it's pretty amazing what's happened in Richard's life over the span of your relationship with him. And it's really inspiring what has transpired as a result of the relationship that you two, I mean, you kind of alluded to some of it this summer. You're still getting stories to this day.
Yeah.
So give us a couple of examples of things that have transpired that have really stood out for you, that, the impact that came that as a result of this friendship and relationship that you two have, that would have never happened if you would have not had that relationship.
A very good example of a success story that came out of that seminar, and not just the seminar, but I mean, we teach this stuff now, and it's woven into a lot of my content and material. But there was a guy named Ed Haricki who went to that seminar, and he was in the small business lending space.
Okay.
And he had this company, and he realized, so 10 years ago, getting a small business loan was like a tooth extraction. Okay, credit reports and faxes, and you got to wait, a week for the bank to get back to you. And Ed realized that we needed to proposition simplify small business loans and make them really fast and really easy. And so that really boiled down to two things. One of them was they needed a way to make sure that to lower their risk.
Mhm.
And so I don't know whether they invented this idea or got it from somebody else, but I know that when they started doing it, it was a very new thing, which was it comes through your merchant account, and the lender inserts themselves between your merchant account and your bank account.
Okay.
And so the loan comes into your bank account through your merchant account. And then when your customers buy things from you, they take 5 or 10% off the top of every single transaction until the loan is paid back.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh.
And so that was a way of having a very high likelihood that the bank would at least get most of their money
Mhm.
instead of chasing the person around and waiting for them to write a check.
Yep.
And then the other thing they did is they needed a way of judging the creditworthiness of the person without a credit check really fast, like hopefully within minutes or no more than an hour.
Okay.
And so they had to 80/20 credit reliability signals, which they did. And they dug around through the bowels of the internet and all the different data services until they had a set of signals that were reliable enough that they could issue a small business loan without a formal credit check.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they started turning around loans in an hour.
Wow. Wow.
And they called it Loan Builder, and PayPal bought that business for a very large amount of money. And now when you log into PayPal and they are offering you money, that's the machine through which it is done.
Sure. Which you see that whenever you log into PayPal pretty much now, they always have an offer of, hey, we'll extend you credit.
Right. And that's exactly how it works.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
They're loaning you money that gets paid back through the PayPal payments that are coming back to you, and they take a % off until the loan is paid back. And that was born. Richard Koch's seminar and a number of conversations I had with Ed Haricki, and then he would go to his team and he called them star meetings, and he would have star meetings with his team, and he'd go, we have to be a star, we have to be #1 in a growing market, which is this small business credit market, and we have to proposition simplify this. If we proposition simplify this enough, it will make us #1 because we can turn the loan around faster and get enough loan velocity and then buy the ads and do the marketing and everything, and we'll be #1. And that is now a multi-billion-dollar business. And you could say that it was born at Richard's seminar in 2014.
Yeah.
And it was based on these very simple principles. And so the way that it works, and this is kind of part 2 of the answer, is I've learned to think this way. The way most people think about business problems is they go, oh, I got this problem. It's really complicated and it's got all these moving parts. And so I guess I need to go read 12 books. And somewhere in those books, I'm going to find an answer. And they just like run all over the place, like crazy.
Yeah.
The way I at least try to train myself to think about business problems is there's not 172 problems here, there's 3. And they all come down to very simple principles. Like the reason you can't meet payroll, or the reason that you're slipping behind in the market, or the reason you're not selling this thing is it's either you haven't made it simple enough and elegant enough for the customer, or you haven't picked a market where you can be #1 and the market is not growing.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And it makes it so much simpler. And I'll tell you a little, I'll tattle on myself a little. After our seminar, the day after, it was over, we're all relieved, it went okay. I think you know that feeling, Kevin. I go to Richard's hotel room, and we have a debrief. And I said, okay, I got one last question. We've now been working on this together for a year. Do you have any observations or things that you think I need to hear? And he goes, yes, Perry, you're the epitome of 2080.
Nice.
Because you are doing so much stuff. I think he says, I recommend that you do an 80-20 analysis on your business, and you look at all of your product lines, and you look at all of your clients, and you figure out what is the very few that are making you money, and what are the other ones that are actually losing money because you're just running around and doing a bunch of unnecessary activity. And I suggest that you chop down what you're doing and only do a very few things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And thank you, sir. May I have another?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's interesting. I just talked with a friend of mine within the last month that he did that very thing earlier this year. He is involved in, I think at the time coming into this year, he was actively involved in owning 20 businesses. And in the first quarter, he pared that down to 9. And he either sold off or just exited his position in these companies that he was just like, that I'm just not 100% jazzed about and excited about being a part of. If I don't feel that way, I'm not going to be there anymore. And he's like, it changed everything for him by paring down. Yeah. And I think we've heard this stuff. My buddy Jesse talks about this all the time. It's not in doing more, it's in doing less, And what you said about, in fact, I took a note on it, the pressure kills creativity,
Yeah.
And when we're just like, go, 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 and just got all this stuff, and it's like, how can we be creative? We need to have space to be creative. We need to be able to just, what you call Renaissance time, have that time to just think and not produce, not be productive, just think and be able to get clarity, And so I really appreciate everything that you've shared here. I mean, for anybody listening to this that just did not know you before, that is like, dang, Kev, man, that Perry is a pretty amazing guy. How can they find out more about you and what you're doing? What are some resources that you could share with them?
I would recommend that you buy a book that I wrote called Detox, Declutter, Dominate.
Okay.
It is a 36-page book. It's a very short book. It's an easy book. You read the whole thing in an hour. And it integrates everything that I just talked about into, it's my business manifesto. It incorporates Renaissance time, 80-20, STAR principle, simplify into a lifestyle. And it references all the books, and you can watch video. It's got videos from Richard's seminar that you can watch that are part of the online resources. It's on Amazon. It's about $10. Detox, Declutter, Dominate.
Okay.
And it wraps all of this together. What I have tried to do in the last 10 years is I have tried to take these simple principles and make them as applicable as possible, especially for people who are in businesses below $10 million, so that it's really actionable and practical. And the Detox book is our manifesto, and it starts with clearing the deck. Most people are doing way too much stuff. They have way too many distractions, and they can't think.
Yeah.
And there's this wonderful, when you give yourself permission to just stop doing stuff all the time and think, start your day an hour of just thinking, get your cup of coffee and turn on some music with your notebook or whatever your thinking tools are, or your whiteboard or whatever it might be, and just think, what do I really want to do here? And what is the real problem here? And what if there aren't 172 problems? What if there's just 3?
Yeah. 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 Makes it, that definitely simplifies, going from that high number down to 3,
Yeah.
whole lot less to focus on,
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, Perry, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today. I just really appreciate what you shared today, and appreciate the friendship that we've had all these years. And so thank you once again.
Thank you. And I salute you for doing that adoption. Congratulations.
Well, I'll tell you what, thanks for just being there for that conversation. I mean, that's hard to believe that was 9-10 years ago. And because when we adopted Abby, she didn't walk, and we adopted her knowing that like, okay, if we adopt this little girl, this is just going to be something that we deal with. But when we adopted, it was about a year and a half later. It was Christmas Eve. I was in the other room, and Lisa screams, "Kevin, come here, come here." And I thought, like, what's going on? The house on fire or something? No, it was Abby walking. She just stood up and started walking. And that was an amazing experience. And just really, let us know that just who this little girl really is, and she's something else. And it has been such a rewarding experience. And so, yeah, thank you for your role in that, because it's been an incredibly rewarding experience for all of us here. So, well, Perry, thank you again, my friend.
Thank you, Kevin.